started with today's episode, I would like to quickly read you our podcast disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only, and it is not to substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. You should always speak with your physician or other healthcare professionals before doing any fasting, changing your diet in any way, taking or adjusting any medications or supplements, or adopting any treatment plan for a health problem. The use of any other products or services purchased by you as a result of this podcast does not create a healthcare provider-patient relationship between you and any of the experts affiliated with this podcast. Any information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. All right, and now we'll get started with today's episode.
Hello, my name is Lisa Chance, and I'm a fasting coach here at TFM. And we are here today with our very own Dr. Jason Fung for our monthly Q&A. Hi, Dr. Fung. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So a warm welcome to our podcast listeners who will be able to listen to this Q&A with Dr. Fung a few weeks after our community members. This is a monthly Q&A with Dr. Fung where he answers questions submitted by our TFM community members. And since it's recorded, it may be found by our members under the program sections, under past webinar Q&As in our TFM community. I do want to mention that 2 questions were sent in that are repeat questions, and I wanted to direct you to the correct podcast. Somebody asked about GLP-1s. That's episode number 163. Also, somebody asked a question about hair loss, and Coach Nadia answered that in podcast number 72.
Yeah, and I just want to mention too that we have a new coach, Jamie, who works in the community to point people to the right resources as well. So you can also fire off a question to her, I think just in the contacts and so on. And she'll be able to point you in the right direction as to what the best place to look for the answers are. Because I know there's a lot of stuff in the community. There's a lot of materials. So yeah, just fire off a question and then you don't have to wait. She'll get to it and point you in the right direction so that you can find it, because it is kind of difficult to find stuff with all the stuff that we have.
It's like drinking from a fire hydrant sometimes. It's a whole plethora of information out there for you on our website. So let's get started here. This person asked, is sauerkraut okay for fat fast, or should I only eat olives?
I think sauerkraut is okay. I mean, it's pickled, I think, cabbage or something like that, right? For fat fasting, the idea is to do mostly fat, but there are other things if you really want to. And the idea is that that's not a traditional sort of water-only fast, but you can get most of the benefits because the point of fasting is to get the insulin levels down. When your insulin levels cut down, your body's able to sort of release a lot of the body fat and so on and use it for energy. So fat doesn't have a lot of insulin effect, so therefore it does help with that. But sauerkraut also doesn't have a lot as a vegetable. There's just not a lot. And because it's pickled, there's also not a lot. I talked about how vinegar and fermented foods and so on, like sauerkraut, can be beneficial in my YouTube video on the Eat More Vinegar episode, which goes into a bit of the science of why that works. So sauerkraut is perfectly fine. I think it won't be a problem.
This question is about weight set point. A lot of people have questions about that throughout the months. So what happens to the body's weight set point when we're under stress? We get cortisol, we get higher blood sugars, insulin pathway. We're more prone to gain weight during stressful times. Does our body weight set point also go up during prolonged periods of stress?
Yes. The way to think about weight loss is not calories in, calories out. Your body has a certain set point, which is like a thermostat, right? So if you think about your house, you set your thermostat at room temperature, and when it gets too hot, it turns on the air conditioning. When it gets too cold, it turns on the heat. So that's what controls the room temperature, right? Same thing with the body set point. So you have a body set point, which is a certain amount of body fat, and some things are going to push that weight up and some things are going to push that weight down. And the thing is that if you just count your calories, if you just cut your calories, then what happens is that you lose some weight, but you haven't really affected that set point. So what happens is that your weight goes down, your set point's here, your weight goes down. So then the set point's up here. So your body tries very hard to push your weight back up. And it does that by making you more hungry. And if you still don't eat because you're counting your calories, then it reduces your metabolic rate, which is the number of calories that you burn. And that's why the whole calories in, calories out thing doesn't work, because there is that thermostat. Just like in the room, if you have a thermostat and somebody says, and this is what always bothers me about the calories in, calories out people, is that they think they're so scientific, but they're actually completely wrong. Because there is a thermostat, like you might say, for example, that the room temperature is heat in minus heat out. So therefore, all you have to do to heat up your room is to bring in a little heater because you're adding heat. The problem is that there is a thermostat there. So if you bring in your little heater, the temperature in the room goes up, but then the thermostat pushes it back down with air conditioning. Same thing with the body, right? When you're if you're just counting calories and you say, well, I'm just going to push it down, your body pushes up. So you really have to adjust the thermostat. You can't just bring in a little heater to do it. And the calories in, calories out is the same thing. If you simply reduce your calories, your body will sort of push you to go back up on your calories by making you more hungry or reducing your metabolic rate. So the existence of that thermostat, that body set weight, changes everything you need to know. It's not simply calories in, calories out, just like it's not heat in minus heat out. So the thing is that what adjusts this thermostat? Well, certain things push it up and certain things push it down. So the main things that are going to push it up is going to be insulin and cortisol. They're hormones, because everything in our body is controlled by hormones. So if you think about the insulin, we know this because if you give somebody insulin or drugs that stimulate insulin, weight goes up. If you give somebody cortisol, which is a stress hormone, like prednisone, weight goes up. And it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how much you exercise. It doesn't matter any of that. If your cortisol goes up, your weight goes up, and weight going up is the same thing as your body set weight being pushed up. There's certain things that push it down too. And, so lowering the insulin, lowering the cortisol is important, but also things like GLP-1 are going to be important because we know that when you give somebody GLP-1, their weight goes down. There are other hormones too, like sympathetic tone, for example. When your sympathetic tone goes up, then your weight goes down. That is, your sympathetic tone is your fight or flight response. We know this because of studies in drugs. So there's an old weight loss drug called fen-phen, which basically was a stimulant. And because it stimulated you, your sympathetic tone went up. So if you think about the fight or flight response, if you see a lion or something, then cortisol goes into, or if you're right, but your sympathetic tone goes way up. So adrenaline, noradrenaline go up and you activate your sympathetic nervous system. At that time, you're not really hungry. You're not thinking about eating or anything. So it's the same thing. When you stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, then you basically don't have the same hunger to eat. You don't have the same drive to eat, so you'll eat less, and it pushes your weight down. So the old drug fen-phen was important for that. Nicotine, people who smoke were thinner than those people who didn't smoke. And it's not because of calories, because smoke has no calories and it doesn't burn calories. It's because it increases sympathetic tone and push that weight down. So the thermostat is what's important, not the calories, right? Just like in the room, the thermostat is important, not the heater or the air conditioner necessarily. In the body, it's like, what's your body set weight? If your body set weight is too high, then what is pushing it up and what is pushing it down? So insulin and cortisol push it up. Incretins in general, so GLP-1, but also certain other ones, glucagon, for example, they'll push it down. Sympathetic tone pushes it down. So yes, if you have excess stress over long periods of time, which is the cortisol, it does push your body set weight up. And that's why it's often very difficult to lose weight in that setting. And knowing about this sort of body set weight is sort of very important because it focuses you on the right thing. I mean, we all know people, this calories in, calories out, people drive me crazy because, again, they think they're so super scientific because they're like, well, body fat equals calories in minus calories out. I was like, but you're not seeing the whole picture. That's such a simplistic and completely wrong view of how human physiology works. We all know people who eat like 4,000 calories a day, who don't exercise that much and don't gain any weight. Like, how is that possible? Well, it's because their body set weight is at a certain point. They eat more and then they burn it off because their body set weight is there. So they're eating, natural, unprocessed foods and they're eating a lot of it, but because their body set weight is here, they're pushing it down. On the flip side, you have people who are eating like 1,000 calories a day, but if they're taking insulin, which is pushing that body set weight up, they're gaining weight anyway. Right. So it's really about, losing weight is about understanding what pushes it up, what pushes it down. Fasting is a very good way to push it down because it lowers insulin, not so much the cortisol, right? Cortisol is a whole different sort of beast, but it also tends to increase sympathetic tone as well. So there's sort of a bit of increased effect on that. It tends to decrease ghrelin over time, which is the hunger hormone. So there's a lot of different effects, but I think we do people a misservice by just labeling it, well, it's all about calories in, calories out, which you hear all the time. And it's like crazy because you see all these doctors, these dietitians, these so-called experts who are like, it's all about calories in, calories out. And it's like, you're supposed to be the expert. There's actually no greater calorie expert than that person who has been struggling to lose weight for 20 years. Like, you will not find anybody who knows more about calories than that person. And if you think it's all about calories, then you're not smarter than this person, right? Because you meet so many people, they know exactly how many calories everything is. They still can't lose weight. Why? Because they're focused on the complete wrong thing. They're the person who set the thermostat and then just says, well, just bring in a little heater, just bring in a little heater. It's all heat in minus heat out, heat in minus heat out, heat in minus heat out. And so they bring in the heater and the thermostat just pushes the body weight back down, right? It's the same thing. You're not focused on the right thing, which is the hormones in the body. Everything in the body works on hormones, so you have to know about it. And cortisol is one of the big ones because that's not a dietary thing. So you have to focus on that dietary issue. If it's a dietary problem, if it's a stress problem, then you have to focus on the stress.
Okay, this member put this in the Q&A and she also sent it in. So she obviously really wants it answered. She said she listened to an excellent podcast a few years ago where you and Dr. Peter Attia discussed, among other things, insulin resistance. And you said that you had evolved your thinking about it and that it was not like a lock and key that didn't fit, but instead more like an overflow situation. You described it as a suitcase, the cell, already filled to the point of overflow with shirts, the glucose, and it just couldn't hold anymore. You just couldn't stuff any more in. You also said that it's hyperinsulinemia that drives metabolic syndrome, not insulin resistance. Is that your current view? If not, what is your current view?
Yeah, it's the same view. Basically, the problem is not the insulin resistance. The problem is the hyperinsulinemia. They all go together, but it's always considered that the insulin resistance causes the hyperinsulinemia. So this is the conventional thinking is insulin resistance causes hyperinsulinemia. That's why the two always go together. And then you ask what causes the insulin resistance. And then they're like, I don't know. It's like what? After like 80 years of research, you don't know what causes it, and it affects 50% of the population. Like, come on, that's ridiculous. The other way I see it is that it's the hyperinsulinemia, which causes the insulin resistance. Then you go, what causes the hyperinsulinemia? Well, processed foods, excessive refined carbohydrates, a lot of these ultra processed foods, lots of things cause hyperinsulinemia, eating too often. So if the hyperinsulinemia is the problem, and then the diet is what's causing the hyperinsulinemia, then fix the diet. And then you're going to fix a lot of the problems of hyperinsulinemia. And that to me fits what we see clinically a lot more than the conventional view, which is that there's some mysterious factor that nobody actually knows and has never figured out in all the researchers in all the world for 50 years. And you ask the question, and I've asked this question of endocrinologists, right? So these are supposedly insulin resistance experts. I say, what causes insulin resistance? They're like, we don't know. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, if you don't know what causes it, you can't treat it very well. So the whole way of thinking is that some mysterious X factor causes insulin resistance, which causes hyperinsulinemia. That's why they ignore the hyperinsulinemia, because they say that's just caused by the insulin resistance, which is caused by some mysterious X factor that we just don't know about. which doesn't leave you anywhere good because you have no treatment. If you don't know what causes it, you can't treat it. You just give drugs that do other stuff, like insulin, right? You're giving insulin to a patient who has too much insulin, and you think it's going to do good, and it doesn't. The whole way of thinking is completely sort of ass backwards. Instead, if you think that hyperinsulinemia causes the insulin resistance, then you say, well, how do I lower insulin? Well, low carb diets lower insulin. Eating less processed foods lowers insulin. Intermittent fasting lowers insulin. So therefore you say, well, if intermittent fasting lowers insulin, which lowers insulin resistance, then you can reverse this diabetes. And trials of intermittent fasting show that you can reverse about 80% of type 2 diabetes. So obviously that's a much better logical framework to think about insulin resistance than what we currently have. So what I talked about with Peter Attia, and that was quite a few years ago, still holds. I mean, it's still not accepted, but obviously makes a lot more sense than the other way around.
Okay, this next question is, does an enema stimulate insulin? For example, a coffee enema with, say, kefir, whey, or other added probiotics?
Generally, no. So enemas are fine. If you look at where the nutrients are mostly absorbed, it's in the small intestines. Food goes from the stomach, it gets held and then pushed into the small intestines, then get pushed into the colon, which is the large intestine, and then out through the rectum as stool. So when you're putting stuff backwards, like into the colon, you're missing most of the small intestines. You're not actually going to absorb a lot of stuff. So coffee and whatever else you put in there, not a heck of a lot of that gets absorbed. It's mostly water that gets reabsorbed in the colon, because what comes out of the small intestines is sort of very loose and watery, and then the colon reabsorbs a lot of the water, and then the rest of the waste goes out. But you're not absorbing a lot. Most of the absorption goes on in the small intestines. That's why when you do these gastric bypass surgeries, right? So you cut the stomach and stuff and you rewire the intestines. Most of the time you try and stick the stomach sort of very close to the large intestine so that it bypasses the small intestines and goes right out, and you don't absorb a lot of the calories and nutrients and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, if you do enemas, I wouldn't worry about what's in there. You probably don't get most of it.
Thank you. When we exercise, our bodies will pump out blood glucose to help with the energy needed. For an insulin-resistant person doing aerobics, hard exercise, such as HIIT or a run walk, does the raised blood glucose need insulin to process it? I know it helps with getting more insulin sensitive, but I guess what I need is more of an explanation of what the insulin does in this case.
So insulin, remember, insulin is a nutrient sensor. So when you eat carbohydrates, insulin goes up and tells your body to store some of that. When you're exercising, you're releasing a lot of other factors. So insulin doesn't go up with exercise. But what happens is that a lot of the other counter-regulatory hormones go up and then tells your body, okay, we need to start releasing some of this glucose for the muscles to use, right? So you need to take the energy. So the muscles have their own supply, but the liver and so on will also release glucose into the blood so that your muscles can take it up. So in this case, when the glucose goes up with exercise, so you see this when people, because now people have a lot of CGMs, they see this when they exercise, the glucose goes up. And they're like, is this bad? It's like, no, not at all. Your body is simply releasing glucose that is stored away for you to use. And when you stop exercising, the glucose will go back down because it'll just go back into storage. So in this case, it's not a bad thing at all. There's nothing wrong with it. It's actually a very good thing. It's a natural, normal thing for you to be doing. And yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. The insulin is not going up. In fact, it's down. And that's why it's able to release. You can only release all this glucose when the insulin goes down and the glucagon and other hormones go up.
Great. I have another exercise question. When a person is doing regular exercise routine, do they need to replenish glycogen stores after a workout, or does the body do this on its own? I am told that I should be using a recovery drink after working out. Will this inhibit my progress in healing my insulin resistance, or is water and salt before and after a workout enough?
So when they talk about replenishing electrolytes, so they're mostly talking about sodium and potassium. So you can lose sodium and potassium through your sweat. So if you're in the pool or something and doing a lot of workout, you don't notice it because if you sweat, it just gets washed away, right? So mostly when they're talking about that and on hot days, so this is a lot of the football players who play in Florida and Texas and stuff, they sweat a lot, and that's where Gatorade was developed and basically was a water, salt, potassium mix. They threw in a bunch of sugar to make it easier to drink. And of course, if you're exercising a lot, that doesn't matter so much. But it was the salt and the potassium. Because if you drink water with salt and potassium, it'll taste pretty nasty for most people. Some people drink it during fasting, but it's strange because most of the time you would drink water. So you're not replenishing your electrolytes, which is sodium and potassium. So that's what they generally mean when they talk about replenishing your electrolytes. The issue with a lot of these drinks is that, one, they sometimes throw a lot of sugar and other flavors in there to make it tasty. So Gatorade used to be sort of water, sodium, potassium, and sugar, and that's it. And now it's like got all this other citric acid and natural flavorings and stuff. So they've got all this other junk in there that you don't really necessarily want or need. And then the other thing is that they can add a lot of sugar in it to make it taste better. So you don't really want all that sugar because then you're lowering your insulin, you're doing this, and then you're just drinking a lot of sugar. And it's very easy to just drink a lot of it. So, you have to be careful about that. So if you're taking an electrolyte drink or a mix, then make sure you're not getting all this other stuff that they give you with it. And the third problem is most of them are just basically big money makers. Like they make a lot of money. So really, if you want to take a drink, you could take just or just eat something, right? You can eat stuff that has sodium in it, right? Like, make sure you're eating some nice chicken, or, if you look at bodybuilders, they'll eat tons of like chicken breast and stuff, right? And you put some salt on it, you've got all your protein, you've got electrolytes and stuff. So there's other ways to get your sodium and potassium. You don't have to drink it. You can drink water, and then sometime later you can eat some meat or beef or chicken or whatever. If you're really worried, then get the sodium and the potassium with it.
What about replenishing glycogen? Do you do that on your own?
Replenishing glycogen, no, you don't need that. Glycogen is basically chains of glucose. Your glycogen is a source of energy. Your body will replenish it on its own if you eat any kind of carbohydrates.
Yeah. Because I often go exercise in the fasted state. I'm about 40 something hours fasted when I lift weights. And I sometimes go a whole nother 24 hours before I eat again. So I do like a 66-hour fast, and I'm perfectly fine because I'm fat adapted. So I don't have to worry. My body replenishes the glycogen stores on their own, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And keep in mind that there's two ways that your body stores energy. Glycogen is chains of glucose, so that's sugar, and then there's fat. So your muscles can use either one, glycogen or fat. If you don't replenish your glycogen, your body will start using fat. If you are not fat adapted, you will notice that your performance suffers. If you are fat adapted, your muscles can use it perfectly fine. So there's all these low carb ultra marathoners and low carb Tour de France winners and stuff. So you can perform at a very high level using fat as your fuel as opposed to glycogen. So you don't have to replenish glycogen. You can if you want to, but it is glucose. So it's not ideal, but you don't have to worry about it. Like, when they talk about replenishing glycogen, it's basically sugar. Most of us don't need more sugar. Most of us need less sugar. There are very few people in North America that need to drink more sugar, right? But, they're like, oh, we'll replenish your glycogen. Sounds a lot better than we're going to put sugar in this. It's just the marketing thing, right? The electrolytes you need is sodium and potassium. The sugar you don't need. So that's probably all it is. It's some marketing guy thought, hey, this is a lot better way to say, hey, we're replenishing your glycogen. It's like, no, you don't want to replenish glycogen. If anything, you want less of it. You're going to replenish it fine yourself, unless you're on zero carbs, in which case then you're fat adapted. So
thank you for that. So this person said that they read a recent article on SGLT inhibitors, and they saw in this article that it said, among other things, that this class of drug currently prescribed for diabetics, can stimulate the state of autophagy in the body while being beneficial in other ways. Do you have comment on that?
Yeah, I would say so. What the SGLT2s do is they make you pee out glucose. So if you have too much glucose, then your body is going to produce more insulin to push the glucose into the cells. If your body is peeing it out, then you're going to produce less insulin. So that's good. You're lowering your insulin, you're lowering your glucose, you're peeing it out because most of us get too much glucose, right? Too much carbs, too much sugar. The thing is that on the whole, it's a good thing. So that's why we see actually important kidney protection, important heart protection. So overall, for the general person, it is beneficial. It in no way affects autophagy. Autophagy is stimulated when you don't eat protein. So remember that these are all individual pathways. So the three main macronutrients. So glucose is carbs. So that gets stored as glycogen. Fat is triglycerides, and that gets stored as body fat. And then there's proteins, which is amino acids, and that doesn't really get stored. So when your protein intake goes very low, such as with fasting, or a very low protein diet, so vegetarians and vegans sometimes have very low protein diets, the main thing that detects when amino acids are coming in is called mTOR. So when you lower mTOR by eating low protein, then you stimulate autophagy. So SGLT2s work on the glucose part of things. It doesn't work on the amino acid part of things. So it really doesn't stimulate any kind of autophagy. It's not to say that it's not beneficial because it's working on the glucose, getting rid of excess glucose and lowering insulin. Sure, there's still a lot of benefits, but autophagy is a different thing that you get. So if you fast, you get not only low glucose, but you have low protein. You have zero protein because you're not eating. So therefore, you're lowering mTOR and then therefore stimulating autophagy. And there are drugs that slow down mTOR, and they've been used as longevity drugs. So rapamycin and stuff have been studied for increasing lifespan in animals because the thought is that they stimulate autophagy by lowering mTOR. So that's the idea behind not eating super high protein diets because maybe you get too much mTOR stimulation. That's theoretical, but I'll say that high protein diets have been around a long, long time. I see all these people coming out with this thing, oh, you need to eat more protein. It's like, people have tried that, like in the 80s and 90s, there are all kinds of high protein diets, low fat, low carb, high protein. We've had tons of those diets. Been around a long time and people just don't do well with them. Not that they don't do well, it's that they have difficulty sticking to them.
Speaking of protein and autophagy, this person says the protein requirements are so confusing. If a person has a lot of weight to lose and they have a lot of excess skin, which is protein when your body breaks it down, when you go through the autophagy, right? The misfolded proteins. So when you are done losing weight, how do you know how much protein to eat? Would I need to eat less protein the more weight I had to lose as I was losing weight? Does eating less protein force the body to use the misfolded proteins of the loose skin?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is very controversial, but I'll give you my take on it.
Okay.
So first of all, if you look at the protein, how much protein you actually need is basically set at about 0.8 grams per kilo of body weight. So that's the recommended daily allowance. So this was set years ago in the 50s when they took a bunch of normal people and said, how much protein do you eat? And then they took the average. The average was 0.6 grams per kilo per day. And then they said, well, you really should eat a bit more than that. So they should do 0.8. So 90% of people were eating 0.8 grams per kilo per day or less. These are healthy people. So that's how they came up with the recommended daily allowance. They said, well, if you eat 0.8 grams per kilo per day, you're eating more than 90% of this healthy population. Therefore, we know you're getting enough. So that was how we came to 0.8 grams per kilo per day. Most Americans are around 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilo per day, which means you're eating about 50 to 70% more. If you're overweight, it's estimated that you have about 50% more protein than a normal weight person. Because remember, to support the fat, you need other things, including connective tissue, blood vessels, skin, right? So it's not just that you have excess fat, you also have excess protein because you're bigger. So you have more other tissue, which is proteins. So you're not only have too much fat, you have about 50% more protein. So the idea of eating more protein because you need it is probably not there. Like one, we're eating as a population, we're eating 50 to 70% more protein. If you're overweight, you've already got 50, 60% more protein than you really need to have. So the idea that you need to eat more protein is probably not true. Now, it's not to say that you can't do better with a high protein diet because protein is very satiating. So if you eat protein like meat and fat, it tends to keep you full longer than if you eat white bread, for example, which, you eat it and then you get hungry sort of right away. Yeah, so or you get more hungry. So the idea is that you don't need the protein. If you eat a high protein diet, then it's not to say that eating a high protein diet won't work for weight loss, but you don't need all that amino acids. You don't need all that protein to be healthy. There's lots of people who are out there, and I think they're wrong, who say, oh, you need to eat like 2 grams per kilo per day because you have sarcopenia, which is age-related loss of muscle. And I'm always like, frig, man, if I could just eat and build muscle, like all of us would have excess muscle. We'd have an excess muscle problem, not an excess fat problem. You can't build muscle by eating. The thing that I never understand how people always, they talk about it as if they're so smart, but it's like, what? If I eat protein, I'm going to build more muscle? No, you only build muscle if you exercise. That's the only way. You put your muscles under stress, you get stronger. You don't do it by eating. Right? If I could sit in my bed and eat all day and be super muscular, that's what I'd do. But obviously it doesn't work. If you exercise a lot, yes, you may need more protein because you're breaking down your muscle, right, with exercise and then rebuilding it. If you are very low in protein, then yes, like some vegetarians and vegans, then yes, you need to eat more protein. But most of us are well above the recommended daily allowance. So I don't think you should eat low protein, but I don't think you should eat super high protein either. People are always like, you need the protein to build muscle. It's like, okay, well, tell me how that's going to work exactly. Like when I eat that steak, which muscle in my body gets stronger? None of them, because I didn't exercise. It's only when I walk, when I run, when I lift weights, when I swim, then my muscles will get stronger. You don't build your muscle by eating protein, which I always think, what the hell? Like there's so many people out there, especially on these bro science podcasts. And remember, these guys are the guys that are lifting like 6 times a week sort of thing, right? Yes, they need more protein, but it's not the guy who exercises like 30 minutes a week who's going to eat more protein and get more muscular. Like that's just not going to happen. So I always think, wow, there's so many people out there who are just saying, eat more protein, eat more protein, eat more protein. It's like, and what do you think it's going to do? Like how physiologically do you go from eating a steak and doing no exercise to losing weight and getting shredded? Like that doesn't work that way, right? I wish it did. Everybody wishes it did. That's why they sell these podcasts and stuff. It's like crazy to think that people are like, well, you just need to eat protein to gain muscle. It's like, no, you need to exercise. You need enough protein, but you don't go overboard because it's not going to do you any good. I wish it did, right? And I think that people are getting sold on this idea that you just eat protein and you're going to look like, Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's like, no, you need to exercise to do that.
Yeah. Drink a protein drink.
Yeah. Protein drinks and protein shakes and protein supplements.
Yeah.
It's all big business. The podcasts love it because when they talk about protein, their numbers go through the roof and all this stuff. So they, and it's all these guys who are doing a lot of weightlifting. And it's like, yeah, that's why you're muscular. Because you exercise 7 days a week for 2 hours each day. It's not because you're eating the protein. Yes, they eat protein because they probably do need it. So that's fine for them. But to sell it to the rest of everybody else who doesn't exercise that much as a way to gain protein, it's just completely like, to me, the science is just completely not there.
We've gone a little over. Can I ask you one more question in relationship to animal protein? Specifically.
Sure.
So this person says, I've read some things that say 8 ounces of animal products per week is enough, that more than that has a negative effect, specifically on insulin resistance, elevated bad cholesterol, and other things. So we should get more protein from legumes, nuts, seeds. That's a better idea. I know we're getting into bio-individuality here. So also the types of animal products make a difference. It's not just the processing, but if it's organic or pasture-raised, regenerative, and whatnot. So this member says, I interpret that since saturated fat isn't as bad as we thought, we might eat more animal products. In this case, more than 8 ounces of the recommended animal protein. And it might lower insulin and promote weight loss in the short term. However, can there be long-term effects that are not so healthy from doing this?
Yeah, and that's the controversial, but my take would be no, you can eat animal products. I mean, humans are omnivores, which means you can eat both animals and plants and be perfectly happy with either one. So you can be vegetarian. Protein intake tends to be low with vegan diets because the plant protein tends to be less bioavailable. We're animals, so when we eat animals, we get this sort of complete range of proteins that we need, whereas plants often have certain proteins and not certain proteins, so we don't get the full amount of protein that we need. So, I don't think that there's any detrimental effect to eating more animal products. There's ethical concerns and people have environmental concerns and stuff, and those are legitimate. But my area is sort of human health. As a physician, I don't think there's anything wrong with eating animal products, even a lot of them, because that's the way that we're built. Now, like I said, if people have ethical or environmental or religious reasons that they don't want to eat meat, I think that's fine too. You can do that. But, I don't think there's anything wrong with eating more animal products if that's what you want to do.
Thank you, Dr. Fung. As always, it has been an honor and a pleasure to talk with you, and I will see you again next month. Thanks again, Dr. Fung.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.